While a lot of the fish folk in Bikini Bottom had a surprising amount of patience for Spongebob, nobody can really compare to Mrs. Puff. In fact, there has only been a few times throughout the ever-expanding series that Spongebob's teacher really lost her cool with her student to the point where she literally gave up. That being said though, that tiny glimpse into Mrs. Puff's mindset might have been just enough to reveal who she really was and the dark past that she carried with her into Bikini Bottom. And if this theory proves to be true, then the popular boating instructor has been hiding a horrific secret about her boating school for a very long time. If you've ever wondered why Mrs. Puff seems like she would be tough enough to handle the world falling down around her, that's probably because there's a good chance she already experienced it. Figuratively, of course, unless there's a multiverse, but we won't get into that. Nevertheless, there's a popular fan theory floating around that suggests that Mrs. Puff had a life before she moved to Bikini Bottom that was similar to the one she had in the series. However, after making a crucial mistake, she was forced to make a new name for herself as she moved to a new city to start over. Now, the interesting thing about this theory is that it isn't like Mrs. Puff did something embarrassing that caused her to move away. Instead, the theory suggests that what Mrs. Puff did was so bad that she became a wanted criminal, and oddly enough, that's something that's been hinted at on multiple occasions throughout the show. The main concept for this dark theory is that Mrs. Puff had always been a boating instructor, only not in the Bikini Bottom and not under that name. It's believed that she originally lived in New Kelp City, where she ran a boating school where she handed out boating licenses to every student that deserved one. The only issue was that she had one student that was simply unteachable no matter how much she tried, and much like she did with Spongebob in the Bikini Bottom, Mrs. Puff cut corners which led to an unknown disaster. And according to the theory, the boating instructor gave a license to someone who didn't know how to operate a boat properly, and that fish ended up getting in a lot of trouble after getting into an accident of sorts. That trouble bled over to Mrs. Puff, who at the time was going by a different name and just indirectly caused an accident by permitting someone to drive that was clearly unfit. That put the boating teacher in hot water, and instead of facing her crime and doing the time, this theory suggests that the pufferfish uprooted her life and went on the lam. After running away from New Kelp City, Mrs. Puff landed in the Bikini Bottom. There she purchased a piece of property that included a lighthouse, created a new identity for herself, and opened up her boating school where she specifically swore that as long as a student is willing to learn, she will never give up. And from that point on in her life, Mrs. Puff had been living a lie and was doing her best to stay out of the spotlight so that the law couldn't track her down. Now, admittedly, that does sound like a lot, but before you dismiss the theory, there is actually a lot more depth to it, and as you find out more, you might be surprised at how well thought out the idea of Mrs. Puff being a former criminal really is. While there are a few scenes earlier on in the show that point towards something terrible that led to Mrs. Puff being a wanted criminal, no episode was as brazen about it as an episode in season 12 titled Lighthouse Louie. This was the first episode in which Mrs. Puff's lighthouse played a major role, and the entire episode was based around the premise of Spongebob cleaning out all the excess junk that Mrs. Puff had been hoarding in the lighthouse. And as Spongebob sifted through the junk and threw things out, there were a few objects that flashed on the screen that seemed to support the idea that Mrs. Puff was a criminal on the run from her former life. Because you see, the first thing that a lot of people noticed as Spongebob entered the lighthouse was a file that actually had Mrs. Puff's name on it. And so there you have it, Mrs. Puff was a former criminal. No, I'm just kidding, we got more to this story than that. This might not seem like anything out of the ordinary, but when you really think about it, it's kind of strange that Mrs. Puff had a file with her own name on it. While it's definitely normal for a teacher to keep files on their students, they typically wouldn't keep one on themselves, and if they did, they likely wouldn't label it with their own name. It would probably just say something like personal written on the label. But according to this theory, that file was the one that Mrs. Puff used to map out her new identity when she chose to evade the law. She studied that file to make sure that she had her entire new life memorized, and when she was done, she simply put it with the rest of the junk she hoarded in her lighthouse. That's not the only bit of evidence from Lighthouse Louie that could be used to support this theory though, and though this next image flashed across the screen in a mere second, after pausing, it's clear that Mrs. Puff was running from something in her past, and it looks like that something made her a wanted fish. During the episode, there's a scene where Spongebob is using his mouth as a trash compactor at the end of an assembly line as he swallowed a heap of trash from the lighthouse, and if you look closely, you'll notice that one of the pieces of garbage was an old newspaper. If you pause on that frame, it's interesting to see that the animators took the time to clearly write out the headline for eagle-eyed fans to read, and right there you can see it clear as day. Next to a very familiar picture of Mrs. Puff, the headline read, "Deranged Boat Teacher Makes Getaway," which was clearly a hint that there is more to Mrs. Puff than meets the eye. And believe it or not, that single newspaper revealed a lot more than just the headline. If you take a look at the small print on the top of the newspaper, you can see that it was from the New Kelp Post, which implies that whatever crime Mrs. Puff supposedly committed took place in New Kelp City. And because of that, this theory suggests that before before she fled to the Bikini Bottom, Mrs. Puff lived in New Kelp City, where she worked as a boating teacher. Now, the use of the word deranged in the headline is worth noting because that could be a hint towards a more sinister side to Mrs. Puff that showed itself after she had been deemed a criminal by the law. And on top of that, if you look at the really small print underneath the headline, the newspaper article suggested that Mrs. Puff distracted the police with balloon animals, which is something fans have actually seen her do in the past. In the episode No Free Rides, Mrs. Puff did something that initially seemed harmless, but now seems like it might have been a hint towards her much darker side and her criminal history. As Mrs. Puff attempted to steal SpongeBob's boat after giving him a license that he didn't deserve, she did a sort of ritual before attempting the crime. Mrs. Puff could be heard saying, "I hope I still remember how to do this," before she took out a balloon and turned it into a balloon animal. She then began to snicker to herself like it was some sort of inside joke, and according to this theory, it was. This act in No Free Rides and the newspaper article in Lighthouse Louie both seem to support the idea that Mrs. Puff liked to use balloon animals to evade the law whenever she committed a crime, which in itself implies that she may have been a savvy criminal. And honestly, if the theory is correct, her motive behind the crime wasn't necessarily malicious, and more so due to a lack of patience or possibly even her sanity. You see, the same episode that revealed her strange balloon animal ritual also hinted that SpongeBob wasn't the first student that she gave up on. As the episode showed, Mrs. Puff had finally had enough of SpongeBob's antics, and after being pushed to her breaking point by a student that was excitedly stating that he would be in her class for another whole year, she did something truly terrible. She broke and gave SpongeBob a license, even though she knew full well that he wasn't ready for that responsibility. And because of that, Mrs. Puff ended up having a breakdown in the middle of the episode that once again hinted towards a much darker past relating to a boating school accident that turned her into a wanted criminal. In No Free Rides, after she gave SpongeBob his license and discovered that his parents gave him a boat, Mrs. Puff had a nightmare that her student destroyed the Bikini Bottom as he drove around. And when she woke up from her dream, she said a very revealing line as she yelled, "What have I done? Everyone will know I let him slide through school. I'll have to move to a new city, start a new boating school with a new name." And if that wasn't revealing enough, she wrapped up the statement by saying, "No, not again," implying that she had done this before. Much like the theory suggests, this episode seems to point towards Mrs. Puff having a past life in which she didn't go by the name Mrs. Puff. And during that time, she ran a boating school in which she had a student that she had given up on, much like she did with SpongeBob. Only that time, when she gave out a license to someone who didn't know how to drive, it likely ended in some sort of tragedy which resulted in Mrs. Puff being held responsible. And instead of facing her crimes, the pufferfish used balloon animals to distract the authorities as she made her escape to Bikini Bottom, where she began her new life. What do you think about this theory though? Was Mrs. Puff a criminal who nearly made the same mistake twice by giving out boating licenses that hadn't been earned? Make sure you let us know in the comments below.